Hello, Bob Reedfield here, preaching and teaching minister of the Spring Hill Christian Church, and welcome to another lesson on Ecclesiology, or Doctrine of the Church. Last week we finished up our lesson on the Lord's Supper, and today we're going to talk about another common practice in the New Testament church. That's the giving of gifts and offerings. We're going to talk just a little bit about the reasonable portion principle, the first fruits principle, and then other biblical guidelines. So let's get started, and let's first talk about the reasonable portion principle. The biblical rule for giving is to give an amount that sufficiently honors God and yet leaves you enough to adequately meet your own needs. The key to giving is percentage of income rather than a particular dollar amount. You can see Mark chapter 12, verses 41 through 44. The percentage one gives should be high enough that it does not imply an offense to God, as if you don't really care very much for him. Yet the percentage should not be so high that it creates an unreasonable hardship for the giver. You can see in Deuteronomy 16, verses 16 through 17, Acts chapter 11, verses 29 through 30, as well as 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 12 through 15. The Old Testament tithe, 10%, is a good example of a reasonable portion. Tithing is not a New Testament requirement. However, it can serve as a useful lesson for the Christian since it has been used by God's people all throughout Old Testament history, even prior to the Mosaic Law. By Abraham, you read that in Genesis chapter 14, and by his grandson Jacob later on in Genesis chapter 28. A Christian should be inclined to honor his God in no less measure than the honor given under the Old Covenant. Once a person's giving has grown to a reasonable portion amount, a Christian should consider continuing to grow in his or her giving. The Old Testament pattern of giving was to give both a tithe and an additional offering beyond the tithe. This suggests the idea of trying to regularly increase your percentage that you give to God as an additional offering of praise. This approach would be consistent with the New Testament emphasis upon a spirit of generosity and liberality in giving. You can see Romans chapter 12, verse 8, 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 6 and 7, as well as 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 17 through 19. And so that's the, the reasonable portion principle. The next thing I want to talk about concerning gifts and offering is what's called the first fruits principle. The biblical pattern for giving is to first take from your income the amount you have pledged to give God, and then trust what remains will provide for your needs. The Old Testament concept of first fruits giving in Exodus 23:19 and Deuteronomy 18:4 was derived from their farming background. Give to God the first gathering from a crop, and then trust God's providence to allow you to gather the remainder of the crop for your own use. Thus, first fruits giving is a biblical way of challenging our faith and putting God's providence to the test. Proverbs 3 verses 9 and 10, Malachi 3, 10 through 12, and 2 Corinthians 9, 6 through 11. The principle of first fruits giving does not require that the frequency of giving must match the frequency of income. For example, a person who is paid monthly or twice a month, or the farmer who has income after the harvest is sold, could still give on a weekly basis. The plan would be to set aside a designated amount to be given when the income arrives, and then distribute it according to the desired pattern. And so that's the first fruits principle. Now, as far as other biblical guidelines, the New Testament precedent for giving and receiving gifts is to take a collection every Sunday. 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verses 1 through 2, we see that. A weekly collection has an advantage for the church's ministry in that the total amount received on a weekly basis over a period of time is likely to be more than in a single collection. A weekly giving has an advantage for the individual in that he can make it part of his worship each Sunday. The New Testament gives a modest description principle. Giving should be done in a manner that does not call attention to the deeds of the giver. Matthew chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. However, this should not exclude a manner of giving that is intentionally visible enough to set an example for others to follow. Matthew 5, 13 through 16. Those who receive and manage gifts should be accountable to the contributors for a wise and honest use of the money received, to be good stewards. Paul's pattern for dealing with contributions to his ministry was to let people trusted by the contributors handle the money for him. 2 Corinthians 8, verses 19 through 21. And Paul's concern for accountability and trust could be applied in practical ways today. By having more than one person count the offering, by issuing statements that give a general accounting of receipts and disbursements. It's fair for contributors to make all future gifts to a ministry contingent upon how well the recipients use the gifts they have already given. Rather than pressure people into giving, we should try to develop within their hearts a biblical motive for giving to the Lord, as an act of worship, Philippians 4:18, as a Christian duty, 1 Timothy 6:18, as participation in someone else's ministry, Acts chapter 4, verses 32 through 37, 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 1 through 5, and chapter 9, verses 12 through 13, as an investment in our eternal destiny, Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 through 21. So I hope whatever guideline you use, either the reasonable portion principle or the first fruits principle, along with some other New Testament precedents and guidelines, I hope that you take this seriously and go to God in prayer to come up with the way that you would do your regularly giving. And then just go from there. I hope this has been helpful to you as far as one of the things that is practiced by the New Testament church. I hope you have a great rest of the day, and may God bless you.